Okay, thank you everybody for showing up. Yes, this is the title of the talk, and probably the first thing you need to know is who I am. And so I'm a professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, and you see my email address there if you want to contact me about the sorts of things that I'm talking about today, because I think they're quite important. And in a sense, quite appropriate to this kind of conference, which is about branding. And here I'm going to be talking about branding humanity. Okay? So for the past 15 years or so, I have been very much concerned about the future of humanity, not only in terms of people living on the planet and so forth, but what exactly is added by human, by saying something is human. What exactly is added by that, okay? And so my premise for this talk is that being human is a stranded asset, okay? And so in business, as you probably know, a stranded asset is something that in a way is bunched up together with other things that ends up making the thing look bad, okay? But really it has a hidden value that hasn't yet been explored. And so to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here at the outset, I would say that humanity is a stranded asset largely because we've got two competing notions of value in the world that in a way go beyond the human. One of them is life, and humans are not the only form of life, and the other is intelligence, and humans are not the only form of intelligence. And that's where the problem starts, right? Because in both respects, the human looks disadvantaged. Okay? So in case this is not obvious to you, let me just spell it out a little bit before I go further. In terms of human with relation to life, if we talk about the kinds of environmental crises that we're in, and we talk about the way in which various species are being extinct, and we live in this world where biodiversity is being minimized, who is the culprit? Human life, right? So we value life, but the humans are the bad guys, okay? That's on the environmental side. Now let's look at it from the intelligence side. On the intelligence side, of course, humans have always, you might say, set the gold standard with regard to what intelligence is. But ever since we started moving in the direction of artificial intelligence, the humans have always had to play catching up. Okay? And so from that standpoint, right, the humans look like they're falling behind. So the humans look like the laggards in that race as well. And we're sort of imagining a point where artificial intelligence might take over all of our jobs, blah, blah, blah. You know all about that kind of stuff. But in either case, whether we're talking about living or we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about the human in a disadvantaged position. That's my starting point. Okay? And I think to a large extent, especially for those of you who are from the younger generation, I think you probably understand this more than I think people from the older generation do. Because in terms of the kinds of identities that people in the younger generation are forming, right? And these are the people who are going to be the future people who hold power and who will be consuming. These people are increasingly identifying in a polarized way, I would say, on the one hand, in the environment, with nature, with animals, Extinction Rebellion, think about that side of the argument. But then on the other hand, there are these people who are talking about inhabiting cyberspace and becoming cyborgs and merging with artificial intelligence. And in a sense, these are the two paths for humanity with regard to the next generation. And this is why I talk about humanity 2.0. And so this is the premise of my argument. Okay? This is the starting point. And if you get nothing else from what I'm saying, I think you should take this point seriously, because what this means is that there is a branding problem with humanity. What is the value added of being human? Right? What is the value added of being human? Okay? Now, there are two ways of thinking about this. And they're not so different from each other when you think about it, but in a sense, it's useful to kind of put them out there as different positions. On the one hand, you might think about the human is adding value in the sense that the human is the original. Right? The human is the original form of intelligence. The human is the original form of science. It's the original form of art. It's the original form of culture. And so from that standpoint, anything that, let's say, artificial intelligence does, right, will always seem a kind of copy. Right? But obviously that is prejudicing the decision. But nevertheless, I think that is kind of a default position which a lot of us operate from. For example, when we talk about the possibility of AI science or AI art, right, we always say, well, yes, they may be able to do kind of the normal, ordinary stuff, but they'll never be able to be an Einstein. They'll never be able to be a Rembrandt, even though there is an AI program called Rembrandt that can produce Rembrandt-like paintings that Rembrandt himself never produced, and that the art critics can't tell the difference. Okay? But the point is, that is one way to go. One way to go is to say the human is always the original, and you just always want to go back to the original. But I think if you look at it from the standpoint of the way in which humanity has developed, the way in which our civilization has developed, this is a losing strategy. Okay? This is a losing strategy. Now, the other point, the other way to think about what the added value of humanity is to say that the human is specifically what escapes the potential replacement or the potential simulation. Right? So the human is that thing that in a sense exceeds what all the copies are doing, right? What all the simulations are doing. Right? And it's something that in a way you might say is fugitive. It is always moving as the technological frontier moves. Right? So in a sense, we get AI intelligence that can match certain levels of human intelligence, but then we say, well, wait a minute, there's something else we can do. There's something else we can do. And that makes us human. Right? So there is this kind of fugitive kind of position of the human. Right? Whatever escapes the attempt at copying. Okay? Now, my view about the value added of humanity and about the branding of humanity is more in this direction. But it's a complicated story, okay? And so let's move to that. So what I want to argue here is that humanity is a style of being in the world, okay? And that is not perhaps an obvious thing to say, but what I want to say is that when we talk about humanity historically, and I think here's a point that's worth pointing out, that the idea of associating humans as being Homo sapiens, this particular form of upright ape that we normally think about, is only something from the mid-18th century. The word humanity and its cognate terms existed before then. Right? Humanity, as the term suggests, right? Humanity is a quality of being. It does not necessarily refer to a specific embodied being. So lots of different things, lots of different embodied things could be human. This is my point, right? This is my first point. My first point is that we shouldn't think about humans as exclusively Homo sapiens, but rather as any beings that embody certain kinds of qualities, and those qualities are the ones that I mean by a style of being in the world. Okay, I'm leaving the issue open. What is this man talking about? What are these qualities? What is this style of being in the world? And that is an open question. In the sense, that's a homework assignment for you. Okay, in the sense that if we're going to talk about the distinctiveness of humans as a brand, then we have to figure out what is the brand. What is the style of being in the world that could be embodied in multiple ways? Okay? And so that is an important position. And you may know that in Latin, there is this word humanitas, where our word humanity comes from. Now, if you go back to the ancients and you think about what did they mean by it and what sorts of things they were talking about a certain way of conducting yourself in the world. Okay? That's what they were talking about. And that's where we get to the style of being stuff, right? So a certain way of conducting yourself in the world. The idea of being able to stand up and defend yourself, speak for yourself, right? And be recognized by others for having done so, right? So humans recognize other humans, right? It is that kind of attitude, right, that you saw in ancient Greece and Rome, and it's the sort of attitude that in a way got universalized with the Abrahamic religions, I would say, right? This is part of my own thesis on this point, is I think the Abrahamic religions in a way turned what initially was a very elite conception into a universal conception. But nevertheless, it was about the manner in which you conduct yourself in the world and your ability to recognize others who are conducting themselves in that way at all, regardless of how they are embodied. That's the style issue. That's the style issue. And historically, it's been primarily associated with education, right? Various kinds of education, right? Education in how you speak, education, of course, in the kinds of things you talk about, education in how you conduct your body in public, right? That is what it's been about. And that's the style of being issue that, in a sense, we want to get at here. Okay. Let's see if we... Okay, now I want you to look at this. I don't know if you... Have any of you ever seen this thing before? Do you know what this is? You don't? Okay. Have a look at it. Just have a look at it. Okay, so what this is obviously an animation. It's from 1944. It's a social psychology experiment that was conducted in the United States by two German immigrants, Fritz Heider and Marianne Zimmel, who is the granddaughter of this guy who I'll be talking about in a moment, Georg Zimmel, but forget about him for a moment. Let's just focus on this. And what they were doing in this social psychology experiment, and keep in mind, right, 1944, we're about 10 years into the cartoon animation culture of film, right? And so people are used to seeing cartoon characters doing human-like things. And so what they were trying to do was to figure out how abstract could things be for people to read human-like things into them. So we've got this thing going on here, okay? Now let me tell you, okay, in terms of what people were doing, the first thing, even though this looks extremely simple, right? We have a large triangle, small triangle, we have a circle, they're moving around, there's this square there where they're entering and exiting, and they're interacting with each other in various ways. And the point was, even with something as abstract like this, it was very easy for people to see that there was something human going on here. Okay? Now this is called, in the literature, it's called an illusion. But illusion may be the wrong name for it. This may be, in fact, one of the ways in which we, in fact, identify the style of being human, in terms of kinds of interactions that can, in fact, be manifested even if we don't look exactly like we normally look like, in the audience or as I am up here. Right, that you could see humanity in that. Just like you could see humanity in cartoon characters, just like you could see humanity in avatars. And so then the interesting question then becomes, what are we talking about? What is this style? What is this kind of formal? It's a formal thing, obviously. And it's obviously related to aesthetics. And sometimes in mathematics, people talk about topology. Right? A topology where the relationship between things remains consistent even as the look of the thing varies tremendously, as it does in this case. So, for example, when people are looking at this, they often think of, and this is interesting, I think, an abusive family relationship. Back in 1944, where the big triangle represents this bullying father figure, the small triangle represents the mother, and the little circle represents the kid, okay? And so this is what most of these people came up with who did this experiment, and they actually gave enormous narratives describing what was going on. That's humanity. That's what I want to maintain to you. This is humanity, and it can be manifested in many different forms. Now this guy, Georg Zimmel, I want to say a little bit about him because he's quite important. At the University of Warwick, I am a professor of sociology. This man, Georg Simmel, is one of the founding fathers of the discipline from the early 20th century in Germany. Okay? Now, what's going on here? Well, his idea, in fact, he is one of the people who coins this term that we take for granted every day, lifestyle, Lebensstil, right? This idea of lifestyle. And what he meant by lifestyle wasn't kind of in the, because the way we think about lifestyle nowadays is a very limited and perhaps maybe even relatively trivialized notion. But what he literally meant was the style of being in the world, right? The lifestyle is the style of being in the world, right? And this can be manifested in many different ways. And he in particular spent a lot of time looking at how different kinds of relationships in terms of so for example, number of people involved in an interaction. How often do they interact with each other? Think about the pure physical parameters. You're very well aware of this, especially if you're in the business world, right? How many times people interact with each other, how many times they see things, how many of them are they, how do they communicate, all of those kinds of things that typically can be quantified, right? But are formal properties of the human situation. This is what he thought was the foundation of sociology. It was that stuff. And this thing, which was done by his granddaughter, is a kind of version, right, of this kind of way of thinking. And I would suggest to you that if we want to talk about humanity as a brand that has a future, we need to abstract from the particular embodiments of humans and actually look at these formal, stylistic aspects of things. Okay, so this is my point here. Okay, so here's another interesting example. These are two events of recent history. Okay, right here on the left, we have the fire, right, that destroyed the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris in 2019, right? Over here, we have the Live Aid conference, which was in 35 years earlier, which was to raise all kinds of money for Ethiopian famine relief. 2.5 million people were affected by that. 1.2 million people died. And so all the pop stars of the world did 2 concerts, one in London, one in Philadelphia, in aid of these people. Okay? Now, here's the thing. This event, the Notre Dame Cathedral fire in April 2019, raised 3 times more money than the 2 concerts did for the Ethiopians. And that's controlling for inflation. So you control for inflation. What you basically have is $900 million, $300 million. Okay? Now what's going on there, guys? Right? It's something about humanity. And I will tell you, this is where one argument I always use to people about how our concept of humanity is not that closely tied to actual Homo sapiens. But it is tied to something, and this is why artifacts are so important, right? In certain kind of style of being in the world that in some sense can be embodied in a cathedral that goes back to the 12th century that's been burned down multiple times. It's not the first time Notre Dame's been burned down. It was burned down during the French Revolution, for heaven's sakes, right? I mean, and but nevertheless, what accounts for the difference? I mean, President Macron actually had to return the money because he was embarrassed. Okay? So this, in a sense, gives you a sense of how people think about humanity spontaneously, right? And anyone who's ever been involved in any kind of development aid program to raise money for people who are poor or under very adverse conditions environmentally, no, it's an uphill struggle because as soon as you're not on the front page, people forget. People forget about other Homo sapiens, but they don't forget about this. Okay? This is the style of being issue, people, because the point I want to make to you is I'm not talking about something superficial here. I'm talking about something that goes deep. And we have to figure out what exactly is going on with this. Okay? Here's another thing. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, uncanny valley. Have any of you heard about this idea? Right, the idea is, this is an artificial intelligence idea. And here's the thing. So this Wall-E, right? This rope, it doesn't look like Homo sapiens, does it? Right? But this is much more relatable as human than this thing here, which kind of has a sort of human face, but the way it operates seems like zombie-like or robotic, right? Where you have this phrase, right? And this is the uncanny valley. In other words, if you actually try to make artificial intelligences look physically like Homo sapiens, right, there is a point, right, at which it just it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because when people are cluing into what is human, they're not just cluing in to some very obvious, facial, whatever features, physical features of the human, right? They're looking at the general manner of behavior, the way it conducts itself in the world, and the extent to which we can relate to it, right? So it's a relational thing. And so the uncanny valley is a very interesting feature of artificial intelligence, and it's very often used as an argument against, however intelligent we end up making our robots and so forth, that it will backfire if we actually make them look like Homo sapiens. Because that's not really, if that's the thing we're focusing on, we're not going to get to the goal of what it means to be human, because it's not about the embodiment in any kind of obvious way. Again, it goes back to the style of being. Okay. So, if humanity is a brand, right, as I have said in the beginning, what does it sell? And this is a tricky issue, right? But here's a little benchmark for you. As you know, there is this thing called the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, right? And we're constantly sending all these signals out there to space. We send spacecraft with various things that, other creatures and other galaxies might want to look at, right? So we are obviously looking for beings like ourselves. And I think that's a good clue in a way, because one of the things you immediately realize when you get into the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is that you're looking for creatures that are kind of like us but don't look anything like us. And so we're forced to sort of step back and think a bit more abstractly about what it means to be a human being. And so that's an interesting kind of benchmark for how to think about the brand human, right? Because, you have all these scientists there thinking, okay, if there are all these beings who will recognize us, right? They may not know the term humanity, they may not know the term Homo sapiens, but they will recognize us, as beings that should not just be automatically destroyed, but beings that are worth dealing with. That is a very interesting exercise, because in a sense, that's what the branding's about. It's about how we present ourselves to these radically alien environments. Okay? And so I would say that's one thing to think about if you want to talk about, how to sell humanity as a brand. And then the other thing, of course, some of you may recognize this, right? So this is Harrison Ford when he's Agent Decker in Blade Runner 1982. And he is dealing with, he has this machine here that he's using, right? If you know about Blade Runner, you know the whole premise of that film is that there are these replicants who look very much like human beings and act very much like human beings, but are in a kind of insurrection that may destroy the earth. And so Agent Decker gets enrolled to basically find out who these guys are, right, to tell who the replicants are from the humans. And so he's working there in this example with this thing that in the movie is called the Voight-Kampff test, which is based on the Turing test, okay? And some of you may know about the Turing test. And that is the test that is used to tell the difference, right, between a human and an AI. And this is a kind of souped up version of it, okay? Because the replicants are beings who look very much like humans. They have this kind of uncanny valley character to them. They look very much like humans. And so you basically aim this device, this optical device, at their eyes to see whether their pupils dilate in the right way when they're being asked certain questions. This is kind of the trick of the thing. But the point that I want to make about this, and I'm going to close on this, is that when we talk about the Turing test, whether in the original version that Alan Turing, the computer scientist, came up with back in 1950, or we talk about some very high-tech version of it, like what Harrison Ford is doing, we normally think about the Turing test as something that in a way is to tell the human from the non-human, right? In the sense that it is meant as a kind of discriminatory test. My contention in contrast would be that really what we should be doing is to think about whether the Turing test, if something passes the Turing test, no matter how high a bar we set, that thing might be human and teaching us something about what it is we value about being human. Right? So in other words, we might learn more about what it means to be human by in fact accepting beings who before the test we might not have thought of were human. Okay? And I want to stop there because I think that this is in a sense where we need to go with brand human. We need to, in a way, find out what's distinctive, but at the same time we need to know that as we're confronting different things in the world, alien beings, other ways of being human as they're promoted, they are actually teaching us something about being human and in a sense widening our horizon. Okay, so I will stop here and I thank you for your attention.